And so we get to the turn of the 90s. 1990, my life in film. Take it away. So let's get right into it, because there's quite a lot of films to run through this episode. Let's start with our usual look at the box office. We have Ghost at the top spot, Home Alone, Pretty Woman, Dances with Wolves, Total Recall, Back to the Future Part 3, Die Hard 2, Presumed Innocent, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Kindergarten Cop. So this was the year that Universal revealed their new logo, with music added to it by James Horner. CGI was getting used more and more in films this year, with films such as Robocop II and Total Recall, both using it heavily for either backdrops or for motion capture, as Total Recall did with the X-ray scanning scene. And this was the year that Tom Cruise married Nicole Kidman. It was a marriage made in heaven that was destined to last. The Oscars for this year's releases saw Dances with Wolves take home 7 awards after 12 nominations, and Goodfellas picked up 1 for Joe Pesci. Well deserved. Whether Dances with Wolves deserved its 7 awards, we'll get to my feelings on Dances with Wolves in a bit. Noteworthy films of this year, now there are many. First, I'm going to start off with one that, when it came out, I avoided it. I didn't think it was going to appeal to me. The trailers did nothing for me. It looked like absolute schmaltzy nonsense, and that's Ghost. And so it was a few years later, when I was in my final year of university, that I finally watched this film, and it's become one of my favourite go-tos. It was a completely different film than what the trailers sold it to me as, and I found so much enjoyment in the whole thing. Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore were magnificent. Whoopi Goldberg is amusing. There's a good level of comedy layered beneath it, but it's also a great supernatural story. So many great moments in there, so many elements that I weren't expecting. It's one of those examples of when a trailer lets down the end product by displaying it in its way. And I say it lets down, it was still a huge box office success. It didn't let it down, really. It got the right audience, it got the women involved who were then taking their dates along and yada yada. But it put people like me off who would have just appreciated it for the film that it is, not the film that the trailers made it out to be. That's what I'm on about here. And this is why I don't pay too much attention to trailers whenever I can, because sometimes a trailer can missell the whole thing. Next we've got Hunt for Red October. Now Sean Connery in this plays the most Scottish Russian submarine commander ever in film history, and it's an adaptation of one of Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan novels, and it's tense, it's well shot and well handled by McTiernan, who really knows how to get the atmosphere of the underwater vessel perfectly portrayed. The film paved way for further Jack Ryan tales on screen, albeit with pretty much a different cast every time, and in recent days we've got a great TV series to lean on to. But this introduced me to Jack Ryan. I'd never read any Tom Clancy stuff, I wasn't aware of Tom Clancy stuff. This film introduced me to it, and I sought some of them out, and a lot of them are generic, but the films, I do like the films. Young Guns 2. Now, I told about my love of Young Guns in an earlier episode, and Young Guns 2 was more of the same. This film took the approach of having an elderly man, brushy Bill Roberts, who claimed to be Billy the Kid, who was a real person, he was an actual person who cropped up and claimed to be Billy the Kid and started telling tales of his life as Billy the Kid. And so the film uses this as like an intro and an outro piece, as he begins to tell the tale of his final days before he was killed by Pat Garrett. He was killed. Yeah, he wasn't really, according to this, and according to the real life guy, he wasn't killed. There's some creative license taken in the tale, but there's actually a substantial amount of historical accuracy within this. And historians who've studied the life of Billy the Kid and this era have pointed to this film as a great example of being able to tell the tale with the authenticity, but embellish it in the way that Billy the Kid himself would have embellished the tale. It's not as punchy as the first film, I have to say that straight out the gate, but it's still a decent western for a modern audience, and have I told you, I'm a bit of a fan of westerns. And Estevez is still one great Billy the Kid. Flatliners. Now, Kiefer Sutherland was in Young Guns too, but he also took front and centre in this Joel Schumacher film. He'd already worked with the director on Lost Boys in 1987, and this one sees a group of medical students experiment with near-death experiences in order to tap into the secrets of the other side, only to find dark, personal demons lurking there waiting. It sounds supernatural. It's a lot less supernatural and more psychological. It's a film that never seemed as good as I hoped. I expected a lot when I went to see this at the cinema, and it didn't quite tick those boxes. But when it came to watching it later on VHS and then repeated viewings through the years, it's grown to be one of my comfort films, and it's a great example of, I've said this before and I'll keep saying it until I'm blue in the face, and I know that some other critics have said the same. Mark Commode has said exactly the same. Sometimes you're just not in the right mood for the film when you first watch it, and so it's always worth going back and revisiting something months, maybe a few years later, and see whether you can actually latch on to what other people saw in it, or find something in it that you didn't spot yourself. And this is a great example of it. A film that grew with me, and a film that I could quite happily slam on now and thoroughly enjoy. Now, the next film I'm not going to go into depth with, because we actually cover it on episode 59 of the podcast, which we also cover on the video version, which you can see if you look at the links down below. Click on it's somewhere down there. It's Goodfellas. Scorsese's story of Henry Hill with Ray Liotta, Bob De Niro and Joe Pesci is a magnificent blend of drama, action, music, gangsters and violence. Like I said, episode 59, video clip down there somewhere. Go and check it out. Miller's Crossing. So I will talk briefly about this gangster film, because I've mentioned my fascination with gangsters and that era, and that's what drew me to this film. And it was the first Coen Brothers film that I actually registered, and I immediately became a fan of their style of storytelling. Gabriel Byrne, Albert Finney and John Turturro all shine in this film, and it's a marvellously atmospheric and well told and well crafted tale set in that era. Love this film. We'll happily go back to it like that. Speaking of gangsters, British gangsters were never as exciting as their US counterparts, but that never stops filmmakers trying to make them look as much. And The Craze was made this year, based on the real life story of the Cray Twins. And the film cast the real life siblings Martin and Gary Kemp as the London mobsters, and it's a film that when I saw it when it came out on VHS, because I wasn't old enough, I was still under the age of 18, so I couldn't go to the cinema to see this. I snuck into a few 18s, but I didn't for this. I saw this on VHS when it finally landed on VHS, and I thought it was kind of cool, and it sparked an interest into reading more about the lives of the pair. But recent year revisit of this film, it's not that good. It's a bit shonky. There are some moments in the film, there are some interesting elements, but it just feels a bit too much like, you know how you get all those people who say, oh, I remember, I used to know Reggie and Roddy, oh, they were lovely boys, lovely boys. You get all the cockneys who pretend that they knew them. Well, that's what this film feels like. It feels like someone trying to tell the story about, oh, well, you know, they were just misguided. Oh, nah, it's still better than that awful Tom Hardy film of recent years, but it's not great. There's documentaries out there which tell the story of the Craze in a lot better way. I can't think of the names of them off my head, but I have seen a few over the years. Interesting backstory, interesting history, just not really well presented on screen. Dances with Wolves. Now, I started watching this back in the day when the extended version landed on home release, and I think it's still running on my DVD player behind me. This film got a lot of negativity, unfairly, I believe, because of like the runtime, the pacing. You know, some people refer to it as snoring with wolves, sleeping with wolves, whatever. But those people either A, haven't seen it, or B, just want to try to sound cool, because this is a great film. I mentioned before it got 12 nominations and won 7 Oscars. Yes, it deserved them. It's a solid film. I mean, this was the directorial debut of Kevin Costner, directing himself in an epic film. I mean, if you take the home release, it's 4 hours long, almost 4 hours long. And yet, when I slammed on that 4-hour version, I'd already seen the original cut at the cinema. And when I put on the 4-hour version, the time flew by. It's just immersive. It's beautifully shot. The music is amazing and captivates. And it's just a solid Western tale. Have I told you that I like Westerns? I might have mentioned it once or twice, but I really do have a fondness for Westerns. In case you didn't know, I like Westerns. But anyway, I'd position this as one of my top-rated Westerns of all time, and I have been back and revisited it a few times. It's due a revisit, actually. I might, once I've finished with me Clint Eastwood revisit, move on to some of the Costner films through the years, because as I've been going through the Clint Eastwood stuff, I've got to Perfect World. Ooh, what a film. Now, Edward Scissorhands is an interesting one, because I was late to the party on this one. I don't know, after Batman, this seemed a bit too fairy tale, and this is another one where the trailers didn't sell it to me. I was going through one of those phases. If anything, it looked like it could have been soppy. I wasn't having any of that. So it was late 90s when I finally, against my will, I must stress this, it was against my will. I didn't want this to be put on the TV in the communal household that I was living in. But sat down, watched it, and was immediately swept up in the dark suburban fantasy of it all. It's certainly one of Burton's finest films, and even though Pee-wee, Beetlejuice and Batman had already grabbed my attention, this was the moment that I decided never to write off anything that has Burton's name attached to it in advance. I would literally, no matter what film he gives out, and no matter how I felt about any of his films, I will always look forward to seeing what he does with the next one, because he still has that gothic feel, he still has the kind of look and style, but he tells magnificent stories and a variety of varied stories. Great film. Never let a trailer put you off a film. Unless it's Aliens vs Predator Requiem. Let that trailer put you off a film. And on the subject of Aliens vs Predator Requiem, we'll move on to horror, shall we? Horror had a few this year that caught my attention. One of them is Tremors. Now, Tremors sees Kevin Bacon, Fred Ward and Finn Carter as the trio leading a modern B-movie about underground man-eating worms. It's the additional support around them, including the magnificent Michael Gross as Bert, who would go on to be the centrepiece of the future films, who flesh it out perfectly. It's fun, it's got wry comic to it, it's got some great moments of actual horror, and it's spawned a franchise that's worth checking out until you get to the ones from 2015 onwards, which the original creators had nothing to do with. There was even a short-lived TV series in the early part of this century that is worth digging out and worth finding. Don't bother with any of the more recent films, like I said. Original creators not being involved, you can tell the difference. But the Tremors franchise is really beloved. I've got all 4 films on DVD, which I've rewatched multiple times. I say all 4. That's as far as I say you need to watch. Great film. Deserves all the love that it gets levied at it by the cult community. Nightbreed. Now, as a fan of Clive Barker, after watching Hellraiser, I sought out his books and started reading and devoured them. This adaptation of Cabal had me hooked when it was in production. And even though the film is sorely savaged and huge swathes of story from the book are missing, it still has a feel that fits. Directed by Barker himself, hence the reason why it feels right. It's a film that I enjoy revisiting. The makeup design is what initially caught my attention on this, and the casting is great. David Cronenberg's in there as a perfect Dr. Decker. Who'd have thunk it? It's one of those films that you can watch it with a lot of love for, but still understand exactly why other people don't love it as much as you do, because it is ropey. It does, because of the huge chunks of the book that are missing, it does really jump the narrative rapidly throughout it, and it's hard to actually make sense of most of the events going on. But as a Barker fan, I've got it. I've got the love. Arachnophobia. So Tremors wasn't the only B-movie inspired film this year. We also had Arachnophobia, which sees a small town plagued with killer spiders. It's fun, it's witty, and if you've actually got a fear of spiders, it's immensely scary. The balance is perfect for a creepy horror comedy, and it's worth watching today. It still stands up well today. Night of the Living Dead had a remake this year. Now, I know, remakes. Oh, we don't need remakes, and why remake something which was so perfect? Well, there was a reason for this one getting remade, and that's because Romero was having a rights issues with his original film. He wasn't seeing much revenue, even though it was starting to build up quite a market on the cult circuit and the rerun circuit and the home releases. He was not seeing hardly a penny from it. So he thought, right, okay, I'm going to take this to court and I want to get the royalties from it. But there was copyright issues and it was falling out of copyright, which meant that anyone would be able to snap up to make a remake. So he, at the same time as him fighting for the battle for ownership, he wrote his own remake. He started working on the story to readapt it, and he got Tom Savini, special effects and makeup maestro himself, to come along and direct it, giving what is pretty much a frame-by-frame remake, only in colour and with Savini kind of effects. They don't go over the board with the gore. It still sticks to the same kind of zombie horror as the original was. It just gives it a modern shine. And at the time, it got a very negative response from the critics, who said, well, why didn't you just colorise the original version and leave it at that, because what's the point in doing this shot for shot? But over time it's become more and more beloved by the Romero fan community in particular, and horror fans in general, to the extent that some people even prefer it over the original. Not me, I still prefer the original, but I've got a lot of love for this remake, and yeah, I dig it. I really do dig it. I don't dig it too much because there might be a body down there that will climb up and start eating my brains. Stephen King's It had a TV miniseries this year, and I'm mentioning it because I know that I'm generally focusing on films, but a lot of people consider this as a kind of film, the same way that his Stand miniseries is kind of considered as a film. And I recall this first being released, and I ended up owning it on VHS. I did watch it quite a lot. It's a decent adaptation of the book. It's got a memorable outing by Tim Curry as Pennywise the Clown, but the second half of it is what lets it down. King's ambitious vision proves hard to represent on screen, and even the recent adaptation has struggled to represent that second half when the adult's going back to Derry. It's still a fond revisit over the years, even though it's not aged well these days, and I do prefer the modern interpretation of it, even though it's not perfect, over this older version of it. But for the life drama coming of age story and the adults reflecting on their past as they return to Derry, that's the part of this whole story that still works in this TV version. So if you get a chance to see this one, or if you've never seen it, it's worth checking out. The cast are really good. So we mentioned Back to the Future Part 2 on the last episode, and I said that it took until Back to the Future Part 3 before I kind of got that film. Well, Back to the Future Part 3 came out this year, and this, as I had mentioned, made me appreciate Part 2 so much more. Oh, and it's a Western. Have I ever mentioned how much I enjoy Westerns? I'm pretty sure I might have mentioned it at some point. Anyway, yeah, this film grabbed me from the start. Just the concept of a Back to the Future Western was enough to make me go, you know what, I might not have been that enamoured with the second one. I was a bit confused and muddled by it. But, whoa, when Back to the Future Part 2 got to the end and it showed the next time kind of clips to give you a tease of what was to come, that's the point which I went, yeah, I'm going to give this another chance. And I loved this film. It plays all the staples of the Western genre. It has fun with it. It parodies moments, but it never forgets that it's a Back to the Future film at the same time. It still feels like a Back to the Future film, despite the fact it's set in the Old West. I mentioned earlier the Tremors series of films. Tremors 4 did a similar thing by going back and doing a Western set in the Tremors universe, and works as both. Worth checking out. But anyway, back to the Future Part 3. The overall tale never forgets to be a part of the Back to the Future series, and I'm sorry, but if you don't feel a thrill when it comes to the final returning back to the future using a steam locomotive being pushing along the DeLorean, then you just haven't got any adventure or heart in you. It's nail biting. Yes, some of the effects look a bit dated now, but you don't care, and it's marvellous. I love it from start to finish, and I will happily rewatch, like I said last time, all the Back to the Future series back to back at least once a year. Robocop 2. Now, Verhoeven headed off to Mars, which we'll get to in a minute. So in stepped Irving Kershner to bring the sequel to screen. And whilst he worked magic with the Star Wars franchise, he doesn't quite have the same magic here. The film tries a bit too hard to continue the dark satire of the first, but without the deftness that Verhoeven brings, it's very heavy-handed. The news bulletin reports have now gone ridiculous. They don't feel natural now, it just feels forced. And even like the little side gags going on feel very, oh, you've just took it to the extreme for the sake of taking it to the extreme. There's far too many ideas in this film. It's got a mixture of multiple stories getting thrust together, so it means that there's not enough time getting left to focus on any one particular thing. And if you've ever read the Frank Miller's original screenplay, you'll realise that he had even more stuff going on. Some of the elements of the original screenplay even made it into Robocop 3 later. His original screenplay got adapted into comic book format, about 12-issue comics, back end of the 90s, I believe. And they're worth checking out just to see how much of a mess it could have been, because I think that the problem with this started at the screenplay. Miller can be creative, but sometimes he can be a bit too much, and in this he was a bit too much. But anyway, it does have moments, and when it came out I did kind of like it. I knew that it wasn't as good as the first, but I kind of got what was going on. But over the years, it's kind of declined in quality on each rewatch. It's still got some enjoyable moments. It's still got some great design work. The design of the Robocop 2 is great. And the casting of Tom Noonan as Kane is inspired. He is marvellous. But generally, after the first film, huge drop in quality. So I said that Verhoeven had headed to Mars because Verhoeven this year gave us Total Recall. Get your ass to Mars. Loosely based on the Philip K. Dick tale We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, this sci-fi action romp is pure Arnie at his best. It's an absolute blast from start to finish. Verhoeven, as always, has fun with the material that he's working from. And the ambiguous ending, which Verhoeven has in more recent years said there's no ambiguity at all. His brain's shutting down. All that happened is all that happened in his mind. It was just a fake memory. But we don't care what Verhoeven said. We like the fact that it could have actually been him being a spy. We liked this idea, and it led to many a debate between people as to what was real and what wasn't throughout the film. I used to love having debates with my mates over elements of this film and things that, well, that must have been a real thing, and do you think that this was real? Do you think? Marvellous stuff. It had cutting edge special effects at the time, some of it which really does stand up today. It has some great humour in there, and Arnie has fun with his one-liners. Absolutely has fun with his one-liners. I mean, admittedly, one of the one-liners is at the expense of someone who's got facial disfigurement, but, you know, that's Arnie. Hardware came out this year, and I include this one purely because of the fact that when I rented this on VHS, I was surprised to find it seemed to be an adaptation of a short story from 2000 AD that I'd read years earlier. And I wasn't alone in this surprise, because Fleetway Comics were also quite surprised when they discovered this, and so they sued the pants off the filmmakers, who had lifted the whole story of a battle droid that was more or less scrapped that comes to life and terrorises an apartment. Due to the legal issues that flagged up, after the VHS release, it never got a DVD release until 2009. Is it worth checking out? I don't know. I only remember it because when I saw it on VHS, I was like, this is a short story from 2000 AD. I don't know if it stands the test of time. I've had no interest to go back to it. But I thought I'd mention it simply because of the memory that it sparked. Predator 2, I'm going to round up the sci-fi aspects with. We covered this on episode 60 of the podcast, and this sequel shifted the events to LA in the late 90s. It had a completely different tone than the first, and it now became kind of a Robocop-esque social satire. I enjoyed this on release, but every time that I've watched it over the years, it's diminished, and in my most recent one, it hasn't held up at all, and it doesn't feel like part of the Predator franchise. Listen to episode 60 of the podcast, or the little video bit. We've got the video bits down there now. Might be down there, might not, might have to go into my video channel, have a look. But it's on there. You'll be able to see me and Lee discuss the Predator franchise completely, which includes our feelings on Predator 2. Lee has a different thought than me, so it's worth checking out. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Leonardo, Raphael, Donatello and Michelangelo. They were given life in this live-action adaptation of the comics. Sadly, in the UK, we were bound by ridiculous censorship laws at the time, and so got a heavily edited version that chopped out things such as nunchaku, because, you know, wooden blocks on chains are more deadly than the swords that they were allowed to show on screens, which, obviously, taking out any scenes with nunchucks in meant that the fights got chopped to bits, or they got panned and scanned and zoomed around, and it was a mess. As a fan of the original comic, I've got a very mixed relationship with this film, because whilst it does do a good adaptation of those first 4 issues of the original comic, it also leans heavily into the feel of the cartoon that was on the rise at the time, which was a lot more child friendly, and so all the cowabunga, pizza and nonsense kind of gets in the way for me. But still worth watching, and I've watched this in recent years, and you know what, I've still got a fondness for it. I still do have a fondness for this film. Dick Tracy. Now this is another comic book film. On the lead up to this film, there was actually a new comic book for Dick Tracy getting released, which there was 3 volumes of like 50 pages each, and it was telling the story events leading up to the film, so you get to know all the villains, all the heroes, everything else going on, and it was basically a way to introduce the world to Dick Tracy again, who had long been forgotten. And the film itself, you know what, I've got a lot of love for this. It is bright, it is colourful, it looks like a comic book. Warren Beatty's marvellous visual style, and also his presence on screen works a treat. I've revisited this a few times over the years. If you've never seen Dick Tracy, I was going to say get some dick into you, but that just sounds a bit wrong. Get it watched. Sequels. Die Hard 2. Now, how can the same shit happen to the same guy twice? Who cares when it's so much fun? It's ridiculous. It makes no sense that all the elements would be at the same place again. I mean, not only is he there to meet his wife, who he's still having troubles with, he's still having problems with his relationship, but the news reporter is on the same plane as everything's coincidental. But who cares? It's fun. This is often overlooked by many people, who will jump immediately to the third and say the third is the second best Die Hard film, and it's far better than blah blah blah, and forget that the second ever existed. No, I think I've got a lot of love for the second one. I think that the setting of the airport gives it a great dynamic. I love the whole additional pedal, because the terrorists take control of the air traffic and so can get planes to crash by faking where the horizontal line is. And it's got a variety of solid set pieces that make it a fun romp. Yeah, I'll happily rewatch this, and I have done multiple times over the years. I don't get the people who are very negative about it. I really don't get why be dismissive about something that knows what it is and it's having fun with it. And on that note, I'm going to be dismissive about a film that knows what it is and has fun with it. Kindergarten Cop. Look, I'm only going to mention this because everyone will moan that I left it off if I don't mention it. But I saw it on release and I didn't rate it at all. It was mediocre. absolutely mediocre. This was the first signs of Arnie kind of going downhill. It does have some good belters in the following few years, but this was the first sign of that 90s Arnie that came out. I revisited it in more recent years to see if it was just that I wasn't in the right mood. See, I mentioned earlier how you must always revisit things just to be sure. Nope, still don't get the love that many have for it. I don't get this film. I really don't. So that's me dumping on something that knows exactly what it is. So I'm a hypocrite as well. Who cares? Gremlins 2, the new batch, came out this year. Now, when given the chance to make a sequel that he didn't really see the need for, Joe Dante argued for creative control, got it, and so delivered. Well, probably not what the studio expected, because it's a film that is a satire mocking corporate culture. It mocks multi-channel media broadcasters, media moguls, and it even mocks Gremlins. Yes, he takes the absurd nature of his own little comedy horror film and plays the absurdity to its extreme. Gremlins 2 is a hyperactive mishmash of ideas, and it more than works, as the creatures are now extremely varied thanks to the addition of a genetics lab with Christopher Lee, the late great Christopher Lee, as a mad scientist who runs it. Absolutely marvellous. The cast are all hilariously fun, and the energy that the film's got, and the little throwaway gags. I mean, you've got a bat gremlin that smashes through a wall and leaves the Warner Brothers Bat logo. Nice little touch. The Witches came out this year. Roald Dahl's Tale is brought to screen by Nick Rogue and is produced by Jim Henson. And again, I'm mentioning this because people will wonder why I've not mentioned it. It's because I've never really had the love for this that others had. It's good, but it's nothing special. Admittedly, Angelica Houston is marvellous, but that's about it. I had a lot more fun with the more recent version of The Witches, and that's a controversial statement that you can hear me explore even further in one of the recent podcasts. And Home Alone. I'm mentioning this again simply because so many people love it and will cry out, how could you miss Home Alone off the list? So let me upset you even more by saying I don't like this film at all. It is garbage. I absolutely did not get the reason this mediocre offering was so embraced. I can only put this down to the period setting, that people see this as a festive film, and as the music charts show, as it gets closer to Christmas, people will embrace mediocrity on the road to Christmas. I won't. I will not embrace mediocrity for any reason. If something is mediocre, if something is mediocre, I won't go, oh, but it's Christmas, oh, charming. I'll go, no, that's rubbish. If you would not watch this film at any other time of the year, then it's not a good film. A good Christmas film is a film that I could slam on at any time of the year and still enjoy just as much. I could put It's a Wonderful Life on in the middle of summer and still absolutely love it. This film, people will refuse to watch it in the middle of summer because they know, in their minds, they know it's garbage. It spawned a franchise it didn't need to. It got rapidly worse as a franchise. How it started low went even lower. It was digging down. It's gone through Australia, it's fallen out of the atmosphere, and it's somewhere out in the depths of space now. In case you couldn't tell, I'm not really a lover of this film. So we'll round up now. We'll do our usual look at the films that I've sadly not seen. Now, some of these are on my list to watch in the coming weeks or couple of months as various projects. So we've got The Cook, The Thief, The Wife and Her Lover, which I've had it mentioned to quite a good few times and I've never got round to watching. Bird on a Wire I've never seen. Cadillac Man, Postcards from the Edge, White Hunter, Black Heart. I've got 2 more films before I get to that in the Clint Eastwood collection, so that's pretty imminent. King of New York, Jacob's Ladder and Bonfire of the Vanities. There's probably more that I've not seen, but they're the ones that stood out as ones that people have mentioned to me and said, oh, I'm surprised you've not seen that. So, are there any other films that I've missed out? Or do you disagree with any of my comments that I've made? Do you think that my comments on Home Alone were a bit too harsh? Do you want to argue back at me? The comments are down there. You know what to do. Pop the message in. Do what you want. Recommend me some films. Criticise my choices of films that I love. criticise the ones that I don't like, or just give me some feedback. And while you're down there, if you've not already, click that little subscribe button. If you're enjoying watching these, then why not listen to the podcast? Check out the little video previews that we've got, just to see what kind of chat and banter we get. The video previews also have some glorious outtakes in, things that never make the final cut. Most of all, watch some films, share your opinions, and never put anyone else down for their opinion. Peace out.